Week 5 of the 2024 NFL season is in the books, and we are hitting straight into Week 6 of the season. We've got injuries, we've got bye weeks, we've got big-time performances from this past week, and big-time disappointment as well. So many wide receivers to choose from, so many flex options, players on your bench, players that you must start. And you know exactly what we need to do. We need to go through every single player at the wide receiver position for every single matchup of Week 6 of the season and break down who you should be starting and who you should be sitting. If we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 6 NFL Pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new customers who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free Brock Purdy over half of a total yard pick'em to use towards Thursday night's action. And don't worry, if you watch this video later in the week, you're still going to get a free pick'em to use towards Sunday's slate of games. On top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. All right, very quickly, let's take a look at the bye weeks for Week 6. We've got the Chiefs, so no Xavier Worthy or anyone else who potentially steps up at the wide receiver position for the Chiefs. No Rams this week, so no Jordan Whittingham, Tutu Atwell. We may get Cooper Kupp back in Week 7. We'll see. No Demarcus Robinson. No Miami Dolphins, so no disappointment from Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle with no quarterback this week. And no Minnesota Vikings, so without Justin Jefferson in Week 6, without Jordan Addison. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. Let's kick the video off with Thursday night's matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the Seattle Seahawks. And this really shouldn't be that tricky of a matchup to go through, but it does feel a little bit tricky. So let's start with the Niners wide receivers. Deebo Samuel, just 10.2 fantasy points in Week 4, 3 fantasy points in Week 5, just 3 targets, 1 reception for 11 receiving yards. Definitely a little frustrating to own Deebo, who had 18 plus fantasy points in his first 2 games of the season, then got banged up, missed Week 3, and then has kind of had a lower ceiling the last 2 weeks. So, I'm not going to panic on Deebo Samuel. For a majority of the season, the Seahawks have played pretty well against the wide receiver position, but not so much in the last 2 weeks, and that includes going up against Randall Robinson and Darius Slayton of the Giants. So, I think Deebo is still a solid start this week. I'm really not a big fan of Thursday night matchups, but we got too many crucial fantasy starters, to consider benching anyone here. So, Deebo, I'm not going to panic. I think you still start him. Still a strong start going up against a divisional rival in the Seattle Seahawks on the road. Brandon Ayuk, I kind of encourage you guys throughout the week to keep the faith in Brandon Ayuk. Start him against the Cardinals. Good matchup. I was also understanding if you didn't want to trust Brandon Ayuk, but we finally got that big performance out of Ayuk that we've been looking for in Week 5. 12 targets, 8 receptions, 147 receiving yards, 18.3 yards per catch, 22.7 fantasy points. So, like I mentioned, Seattle's been pretty decent against the wide receiver position. At least they were through the first 4 weeks of the season before kind of crashing back to earth against the Lions and once again struggling against the Giants this past week. So after this week, the Chiefs will get the Chiefs and then the Cowboys for a bye week. So, good game scripts, interesting defenses here over the next 3 weeks. I think Brandon Ayuk is a guy who stays in starting lineups. And hopefully we see the ceiling stay consistent. Now, Jawan Jennings, on the other hand, since that massive Week 3 performance with 46.5 fantasy points, has just gotten worse and worse every single week. Week 3, there are a ton of vacated targets with no Deebo Samuel and no George Kittle, who's having a very solid season overall. So the targets for Jennings are just really going to be way too inconsistent. And I mean, 6 targets in Week 4, down to 4 targets in Week 5. And this was a game where the Niners needed to throw the football and this game script stayed competitive. So I just can't trust Jawan Jennings. I think he's nothing more than a very risky flex option. Even in week 4, I was, consistently saying, like, I think he's a volatile flex option, and we really need to see how things look with Debo and Kittle back. Can understand if you still want to start him. And he was okay in week 4, but he also had that one really big catch. You take that away, he would have not hit 11.8 fantasy points. So just 3 receptions in week 4. So yeah, I know it's kind of sad because maybe you spent like a ton of free agent bidding on Jennings, or he was a top priority. Still think he's worth rostering, especially if anything happens to Debo or Ayuk, but I just can't trust starting Jawan Jennings going into week 6. Moving along, let's take a look at the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers. Metcalf coming off of a bad fantasy performance against the Giants. 7.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 4 receptions, 55 receiving yards, but he is still a top 20 wide receiver so far on the season. And this Niners defense is suspect, to say the least. They're going to have some weeks where they pop, where that front 7 plays really well, but overall, they don't put any fear in my eyes, especially on the road on a short week. And I don't think we really need to discuss Metcalf a lot. He still has 15 plus fantasy points in 3 out of 5 games on the season. He's still a solid start. It's Metcalf. Let's move along. Now, JSN and Tyler Lockett for a majority of the season for me have just been flex options that have some volatility. But in the past 2 weeks, they both have double-digit fantasy performances in both matchups against the Lions and the Giants. So, I mean, this Seahawks offense is a good fantasy offense right now, and they do want to throw the football. So Lockett, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 75 receiving yards in week 5, 11.5 fantasy points. JSN, 7 targets, 4 receptions, 31 receiving yards, and the late touchdown, 13.1 fantasy points. He also, coincidentally, had 13.1 fantasy points in week 4. So JSN, Lockett, you can flex them. You know there's volatility. You know that there's low floors, but they've had good enough ceilings for majority of the season that they are still both startable players as we approach week 6. And this is a great opportunity to go ahead and take advantage of DK Metcalf's line on Underdog. Currently sitting at 65.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that line in 2 out of his last 3 matchups and barely missed that line by 10 yards this past week against the Giants. Metcalf has been a monster all season long. Go ahead and head over to Underdog, smash the over on his receiving yard total, and don't forget all new users on Underdog Fantasy are going to receive that free pick 'em to use for this week. Pair it with this DK Metcalf line over 65.5 total receiving yards and automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're at it, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. Let's move along to an early window game on Sunday. It's going to be an overseas matchup between the Jaguars and the Bears. And going into week 5, even on Sunday morning stream, Sunday morning's video I put out, I encouraged you guys, don't be too afraid of the rain here. Brian Thomas Jr., Christian Kirk, and majority of the Colts starters are still going to be startable players. And Christian Kirk and Brian Thomas Jr. both showed up in that week 5 matchup against the Colts. But let's kind of circle back to just Brian Thomas Jr. here, who's the wide receiver 5 right now in fantasy football. Great season so far for rookie wide receivers when we look at Neighbors, Marvin Harrison Jr., but also Brian Thomas Jr. He has 11.4 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 3 of the season. In the last 2 games, he has 21.9 or more fantasy points. In week 5 against the Colts, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and a touchdown. You know, the Bears have a pretty good defense, and they've played very well against the wide receiver position on the season. And I do kind of worry about the Jaguars still. I mean, the Colts were one thing. This is, the Colts, Jaguars, 2 of the worst defenses in the NFL squaring off against each other in week 5. Might look a little bit different here for this Jags offense in week 6, but Brian Thomas Jr. is a must start on a weekly basis, no matter what. Christian Kirk, though, the last 3 games, 12.8 or more fantasy points, has been super solid. He's still a good start. Might kind of be a guy that you're just putting in the flex, but he brings you a safe floor. I think those first 2 disastrous weeks are behind us. He has 10 or more targets in 2 of the last 3 games, just 4 targets last week, but he had that big catch in the game. Took him to 88 receiving yards. So Kirk, still going to be involved in this offense, still a good weapon for Trevor Lawrence. And the important thing is that the Jags defense is so bad that the Jags offense has to consistently throw the football, and that helps Brian Thomas Jr. and Christian Kirk. Gabe Davis, on the other hand, we're not starting Gabe Davis. He's still rostered in 33% of leagues, which kind of surprises me. I don't think that Gabe Davis really needs to be rostered. He just has had an extremely, extremely low ceiling on the season so far. All right, moving along. DJ Moore was one of the wide receivers that I told you guys going into week 5 that you should try and buy low. We finally saw a high ceiling game out of DJ Moore in week 5, 27.5 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns, 105 receiving yards off of 5 receptions and 8 targets. And I know it was against the Panthers, but his quarterback, Caleb Williams, did not look so bad either. And now the Bears are going to face Jacksonville this week. They get a bye week, then Washington and Arizona. So a pretty good little stretch here before they face the Patriots, the Packers, and the Vikings, which actually some of those secondaries really don't scare me that much. But I digress. DJ Moore's a solid start this week. We can't really take him out of lineups. This is a fantastic matchup against the Jaguars. Start him. Very, very strong start in week 6. Now, look at Keenan Allen, just 6.3 fantasy points this past week. Rome Odunze, 9 fantasy points this past week. They become flex options for me because of how bad this Jaguars defense is. So, do I think there's volatility, maybe trust issues with Odunze or Allen? Definitely. Rome Odunze, 6 targets last week. Allen, 6 targets last week. It's a good enough matchup if you're dealing with injuries or bye weeks. You can throw them out there, but understand that there's certainly some risk. It's just a very good matchup against the Jaguars, so they get kind of elevated to an area where we can at least flex them in week 6. Along to the afternoon games for Sunday, we will have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Saints. And Mike Evans, just a week in, week out start. Doesn't matter what the matchup is. I know we had those 2 down weeks 2 and 3, but outside of that, he has 23.1 or more fantasy points in every game on the season. He's the wide receiver 6. It should be a tough matchup on the road against the Saints, but we are not benching Mike Evans ever. Hard to even bench him when he was going up against Pat Surtain in week 3 and had his worst game of the season. You know, it's Mike Evans. Now, Mike Evans is a wide receiver 6. Chris Godwin is a wide receiver 7, 11.6 or more fantasy points for him every game so far on the season. Kind of a down week 5 and a great game script against Atlanta, but you know, he still had 5 receptions or 64 receiving yards. Super consistent floor. Nice ceiling with Godwin on the season at 24.7 fantasy points. Don't need to break it down anymore here. Godwin is staying in our starting lineups, as is Mike Evans. Now, Jalen McMillan has been dealing with a hamstring injury. He might be back week 6. He might not be. I'm still not starting him, even if he is back. You know, we got Trey Palmer in the mix, who had a big, or not a big catch, but a touchdown catch, which took him to 11.6 fantasy points in week 4, but then he didn't play in week 5 with a concussion. So that left Sterling Shepard as the next man up. And I did talk about Shepard in the waiver wire video. Like, if you're in a deep enough format, you're absolutely desperate, and McMillan, Palmer aren't out there in week 6, or maybe even they are. Shepard has had 7.4 or more fantasy points in the last 2 games and had a touchdown in week 5, but super low ceiling. I don't think I'm going to go out of my way or anything to start Shepard. You'd have to be desperate in like a 16-man league. So for majority of you guys, Shepard is a sit, but maybe it gets more and more involvement in this, you know, pass-heavy offense as the year goes on. All right, I have to record these videos early on Monday, so Monday Night Football has not been played yet. I'm going to expect that Olave and Shaheed at least have solid performances, even if we see potentially a lower ceiling against the Chiefs' defense. You know, Shaheed can always bust. That's just Rashid Shaheed for you. But I think they're both still start-worthy against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary going into week 6. So we'll see what happens with Olave and Shaheed. Olave especially, I think, is a week-in, week-out starter. Shaheed, very, very impressive in week 4. Overall, probably solid starts. If my thoughts or opinions change or we see an injury, there will be a pinned comment down below. Moving along, we've got the Washington Commanders, who will travel to face the Ravens. And man, oh man, this Washington Commanders offense just continues to look great on a week-in, week-out basis. Terry McLaurin, 13.4 fantasy points in week 5 against Cleveland, 8 targets, 4 receptions, 112 receiving yards. He now has a touchdown or 100 receiving yards in his last 3 games after that slow start to the season. So Terry McLaurin is a must-start player until further notice. Now, in terms of the rest of the Commanders' wide receivers, we've just kind of got like this misfit room of guys. And, there seems to be somebody who steps up every week, and then we just can't really rely. Zacchaeus looked good in week 4. Then he had 2 fantasy points in week 5. Luke McCaffrey has seen some involvement, but not enough to be fantasy relevant. De'Ami Brown did nothing in week 4, but then had 13.7 fantasy points in week 5 and a touchdown. Noah Brown was looking like he may get some involvement, and then he was out in week 5. So I'm not trusting any Washington Commanders wide receiver. Be really nice to see someone emerge and step up as a number 2 option, but I'm not trusting anyone here other than Scary Terry. Now, on the other hand, Zay Flowers, another wide receiver, told you guys to buy low on going into week 5, coming off of 2 really down performances in weeks 3 and 4 after being very solid weeks 1 and 2. But in weeks 3 and 4, the game plan was run the football going up against 2 bottom 5 run defenses in the Cowboys and the Bills. And in week 5, we saw another game script similar to weeks 1 and 2 where the Ravens needed to throw the football. And they needed to throw the football a lot, and we saw the most targets for Zay Flowers so far on the season. 12 targets, 7 receptions, 111 receiving yards, 15.8 yards per catch, and 19 fantasy points. Look, the Commanders are no longer really this team that we can just expect to start wide receivers against, and wide receivers have a great day. The secondary is still struggling, but they did look better in week 5 against the Browns, but that also involved Deshaun Watson. So kind of a tough read. I still like Zay Flowers a lot this week, really regardless of the matchup. Zay Flowers may be a little bit more game script oriented, but I do think that in this matchup between the Washington Commanders and the Baltimore Ravens, we will see a lot of throwing the football, which will benefit Zay Flowers. Now, Rashad Bateman's been a little bit interesting. He had a touchdown last week, a touchdown week 3, did nothing in week 4. I just don't think I can trust Rashad Bateman. He's definitely a player that, like, if there's just nothing on the waiver wire, you're absolutely desperate. He's still tied to Lamar Jackson and the Ravens offense. I guess you could throw him out there, but I just don't trust him. And for a majority of you guys, I don't want you to have to do that. Nelson Aguilar has scored no more than 6.6 fantasy points so far on the season. He has no more than 2 catches in a single game this season. He's not startable moving into week 6. So we're basically looking at our clear wide receiver 1s for both these teams, Terry McLaurin and Zay Flowers. Those are our starts. Everyone else a sit as we approach week 6. Moving along, we have the Cardinals traveling to face the Green Bay Packers. This should be an interesting one. Good matchup overall, I think. But let's start with Marvin Harrison Jr., who kind of gave us a bust stat line in week 5, 5.6 fantasy points, 7 targets, 2 receptions, 36 receiving yards. But MH Jr. is still the wide receiver 12 so far on the season. And I do like this Packers secondary. They've done a good job of getting takeaways. McKinney's looked great, had an interception every game this year. Jair Alexander's missed the last 2 weeks. If he's back, that certainly gives a boost to this Packers secondary. But as good as they've been against, or in terms of getting takeaways, they haven't really been a great secondary at the same time. They're giving up a lot of total yardage, a lot of pass yards, and a good amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So I still think Marvin Harrison Jr. is a strong start. I'm not going to panic on him. I think he's a fine start this week. Still is the wide receiver 12 on the season. Still has 15.5 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 5 games on the season. I'm still starting Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm not going to overthink it. Now, Michael Wilson, 12.8 or more fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 matchups, sitting at 24% rostered, is a player that I think you can flex this weekend. Not my favorite flex, of course, but when we're dealing with bye weeks and injuries, I try to give you guys more options as potential flex guys. And I think Michael Wilson's still in that area of you can throw him out there, cross your fingers if you're desperate on the waiver wire, and potentially get some production, but definitely some volatility involved with Michael Wilson as well. Now, Greg Dortch has done nothing outside of week 1 this year, 7.8 or less fantasy points in every other matchup, 1.7 fantasy points last week. I'm not touching Greg Dortch from a fantasy perspective. Now, Let's talk about the Packers. Jaden Reed, lower ceiling in week 5, 13.7 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 78 receiving yards, 19.5 yards per catch. I mean, Jaden Reed is just the guy in this offense at the wide receiver position that we have to start on a weekly basis. Still easily the best fantasy wide receiver on this team. A little disappointing against the Rams defense that's been so bad on the season, and even got a game script here where the Packers needed to stay in the thick of things and still just got 13.7 fantasy points out of Jaden Reed. But he definitely was not the most disappointing wide receiver on this roster in week 5. That has to be Dontavion Wicks, who is now at 74% rostered, was at a 56% start rate in week 5, and what was a beautiful matchup against that Rams defense, coming off of a 24.8 fantasy day in week 4. This is a tough one because at week 4, game script really benefited Dontavion Wicks, right? But then you start to break it down. He had 13 targets, 5 receptions. 2 of those receptions were touchdowns. So maybe we overreacted a little bit on Dontavion Wicks, because now you look at week 5, 7 targets, just 2 grabs, 20 receiving yards and 4 fantasy points. So the targets compared to the receptions in back-to-back weeks are a little bit worrisome. Than in week 4, almost half of his receptions were touchdowns. So, and once again, that game script in week 4 was like, just throw the football up. Like, we got to get points on the board. And they were actually, Packers were successful with that. But listen, I'm not going to be completely out on Dontavion Wicks yet. I totally understand if you're going to bench him this week. 100% understand it. But I'm not going to be out on him. I still think this is an offense that's going to throw the football with a lot of aggression. I still think they're going to be in situations where Wicks is involved. Totally get it. For most people, he's probably a sit this week. But I think if you don't have anyone better, that we can still consider this a good matchup against the Cardinals, a good game script against the Cardinals, and see some involvement out of Wicks this week that gives him flex appeal. But I won't say he's any more than a flex. Now, we saw some involvement out of Bo Milton this past week, but he just got 2 targets, just 3 targets in week 4. That's been with the health of Christian Watson, who's, I'm going to go ahead and assume, is out for week 6. And then the Romeo Doubs debacle. But, I'm not starting Bo Melton anytime soon. And even if Doubs is back in week 6, I'm not going to start him. His ceiling's been really low on the ceiling, or his ceiling's been really low on the season, excuse me. And, Doubs and Love have a good chemistry or whatever, but I'm just not starting Doubs anytime soon until the situation changes, because maybe he's not even going to be playing in week 6. I don't know. But for now, Doubs is set. Dortch is set. You got a flex option in Wicks. Roast me in the comments. A flex option in Wilson. Then 2 nice starts in Marvin Harrison and Jaden Reed. It has felt difficult to trust Jaden Reed in this Packers offense, but I love his line currently on Underdog, sitting at 60.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in the last 2 weeks with Jordan Love healthy. Plus, this Cardinals secondary has really struggled against number 1 wide receivers. We just saw Brandon Ayuk absolutely torch this Cardinals defense in week 5. So I would head straight to Underdog, smash the over on Reed's total receiving yards. And don't forget, new users who sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch, that link is down below, are going to get that free pick 'em to use for week 6 action. Take your free pick 'em, take the over on Jaden Reed's receiving yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. Next up, we will have the Colts traveling to face the Titans. And once again, glad I encouraged most of you guys to not freak out about the rain reports for that Colts-Jaguars matchup in week 5, because we got a ton of production out of these Colts wide receivers. Listen, I don't know if Joe Flacco is going to be the quarterback in week 6 or if Anthony Richardson is. The reports are that the injury to Richardson is not a long-term injury. But then what kind of happens when this offense just looks better with Flacco at quarterback? I know they lost in week 5, but they definitely looked better. It's a weird situation, but against the Titans on the road here, divisional matchup, this Titans defense very wishy-washy. Pittman remains a start, 14.7 or more fantasy points in the last 2 weeks. Encourage you guys to start Josh Downs. Encourage you guys to pick him up off the waiver wire on Saturday's video as our last-minute waiver wire additions. And he came through 15.9 or more fantasy points in the last 2 games. I think Pittman and Downs, until we see them digress, are solid starts. Now, Alec Pierce, I don't know what to do with. He's in that flex area. He's the wide receiver 10 right now in fantasy football. I guess I like him more if Flacco's a quarterback, but in the first 2 weeks of the season, he had 2 touchdowns and 16 or more fantasy points with Richardson at quarterback. So I think he falls into that category of like, you got nothing better. You can throw him out there if you're dealing with enough injuries in the bye weeks and cross your fingers that he has one of these big games, but he's very volatile. Just 3 targets, 3 receptions last week. In most of in the games where he's performed well in fantasy, he has 5 or less receptions. So, and in 2 of those games, he has 3 targets, 3 receptions. So very volatile, but maybe worth a flex option if you need some upside. AD Mitchell did have a nice performance in week 5, 7 targets, 4 receptions, 38 receiving yards, 9.1 fantasy points. For AD Mitchell standards so far in the season, that was nice, but he's still a sit for me. Haven't seen enough out of him in his rookie season, and clearly is behind the other 3 wide receivers that we just talked about on this depth chart. Now, the Titans had a bye week in week 5, and Calvin Ridley's been basically awful all season long outside of week 2. DeAndre Hopkins has been awful all season long outside of week 3. And then put Tyler Boyd's name on the screen, but he hasn't even been startable. He's the wide receiver 93. So, do I trust Ridley? No. Do I trust Hopkins? No. But this is the Colts defense. If you're desperate, this is all you're left with. Ridley, Hopkins, I think, are startable against the Colts because that is how bad this defense is. So, don't go out of your way to flex Ridley. Don't go out of your way to flex DeAndre Hopkins. But this matchup at least gives them some flex appeal moving into week 6. Except we have the Texans traveling to face the Patriots. So we'll start with the fact that Nico Collins is considered day-to-day as he's still dealing with that hamstring injury that he suffered in week 5's matchup against Buffalo. He had just 2 targets and 2 receptions, but he had 78 receiving yards and a touchdown before he had to exit the game and walked away with 15.8 fantasy points. Collins is the wide receiver 2 on the season. So if he starts, if he plays, yeah, you still start him. We'll kind of monitor his health as the week goes on. Now, Stephon Diggs also been very solid. He's wide receiver 14, 14.2 fantasy points in week 5, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 82 receiving yards. Just a guy that you can plug in and trust for a safe floor and has a ceiling of 21.9 fantasy points on the season. Obviously, if Collins misses week 6, that's going to help Diggs. But either way, he's a solid start. Now, Tank Dell is a more interesting player here. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 38 receiving yards, 7.3 fantasy points in week 5. He's really kind of been pushed back in this offense with Collins and Diggs in front of him. So if Collins does not play, I do think that Tank Dell will have a better week 6. But Dell is just kind of in that flex category. I like him more if Collins doesn't play, and I'm starting to get concerned about Dell on the season with a healthy Nico Collins and Diggs in front of him. And I think that we've already been concerned, but at this point, I've still kind of called him like a volatile flex option after he at least had 11.2 points in week 3. But for the most part, I just don't know if we're going to be able to trust Tank Dell. He stays in the flex category this week because he at least might see improved value if Collins does not play, but definitely contingent on Collins' health. Now, like I said, try to give you guys more flex options as bye weeks start to happen and injuries ramp up. So if I'm going to flex a Patriots wide receiver, it's Demario Douglas. I don't trust anyone else in this offense. I know Jalen Polk basically had a touchdown in week 5, but, the toe being in bounds was not enough and all of that stuff. But I still don't trust Polk. Douglas at least has 11.9 or more fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 matchups. He also had 9 targets in both those games. Any game that he has less than 9 targets, which literally every other game in the season he's had 3 or less targets, he's finished below 11.9 fantasy points by a long shot, 4.3 or less. So I'm not going to go out of my way to start Demario Douglas, but he's just 12% rostered. If you're absolutely desperate, this Texans secondary has been bad enough that I think you can throw him out there. Then in week 7, he gets the Jaguars, so he's on the flex radar. But as far as everyone else, Jalen Polk, Kendrick Bourne, he got his first start of the season in week 5. Keyshawn Boutte, KJ Osborne, he's been banged up. Nobody else is worth a fantasy start at this point in time and probably for the rest of the season. Except we have the Browns traveling to face the Eagles in what could be a really gross matchup or maybe a matchup with a lot of fantasy points. Who knows? Amari Cooper did find a way to squeeze out 10 fantasy points in week 5 against Washington. 10 targets, 4 receptions, 60 receiving yards. My thesis so far on Cooper on the season is that the targets have been there. So we keep starting him because in the early part of the season, this Browns offense has had fantastic matchups. Jacksonville, Giants, who are better than we give them credit for. The Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, the Bengals, the Ravens. Fantastic stretch here that is still going on. Week 6, they get the Eagles, But I don't know if it's going to matter with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. I say we still start Cooper because the Eagles secondary has been that bad. But the Commanders secondary going into week 5 was still giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And they showed up big time, So I understand if you don't want to start Cooper, but he has 8 or more targets in every game so far in the season. This Browns defense not playing very inspired. This Browns offense bad enough that they need to consistently throw the football. So I'm going to keep Cooper in starting lineups against the Eagles and probably against the Bengals in week 7. But we'll see maybe how bad Watson is potentially in week 6. Now, I expected a big game out of Jerry Jeudy in week 5 against the Commanders. He's another player, 6 or more targets every game on the season until week 5, and he just completely disappeared. So I still think he has flex appeal this week, but if you have other options, I would probably roll with them with how bad Deshaun Watson and this passing attack has been. Elijah Moore, just not startable. 4.1 fantasy points in week 5, just not startable. So maybe proceed with some caution with Jeudy and potentially Cooper, but I think they're both startable against the Eagles secondary this week. Now, in terms of the Eagles offense, I don't know what's going to go on here. So A.J. Brown is hopeful to return in week 6. Devonta Smith, on the other hand, has been in concussion protocol, should be able to clear for week 6, but we don't have any official word at the time of recording this on Brown or Smith. So obviously if they play, you start them. And we just kind of have to leave it at that. In terms of any other wide receiver on this team, I mean, Johnny Wilson, banged up. Jahan Dotson, not startable. He was the number 1 wide receiver in week 4. He caught just 2 catches. Anyone else that has shown up at wide receiver for this team has either been injured or just considered not startable. I mean, Paris Campbell had a touchdown in week 4, but are we going to start Paris Campbell? No. And I think, he's back on the practice squad. So then Britton Covey got hurt too. So it's A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith if they're healthy. Anyone else, far stay away. This team really needed that early bye week. We'll see what happens. I think this could be a good fantasy matchup between the Browns and Eagles, or it could be something very disastrous. We'll find out in week 6. Except we'll have the Chargers traveling to face the Broncos. This should be another matchup that might get kind of gross, might be kind of defensive, but overall, I do think we have some fantasy appeal here. Let's start with Ladd McConkey, who I think is flex worthy. Has some volatility, but also has 14.9 or more fantasy points in 2 out of 4 games on the season. He has scored a touchdown in both of those games, so he's definitely a little bit risky. But I think that Quentin Johnston is a lot riskier. Now, this Chargers offense is interesting. I think Quentin Johnston is the wide receiver 1 here for this team, but the way these guys line up, sometimes Ladd McConkey is. So correct me if I'm wrong, or as the week goes on, whoever we think Pat Surtain is going to line up against for a majority of the game, we want to bench. I think it's Quentin Johnston, but maybe it's Ladd McConkey. And if that's the case, then I'm not starting Ladd McConkey, So if Quentin Johnston doesn't get the Pat Surtain treatment, then I think he's flexible. But my guess is that Quentin Johnston's going to see the most of Pat Surtain, and therefore he's a sit, and McConkey's nothing more than a flex. And don't forget, although Pat Surtain's the guy we're staying away from, the rest of this Broncos defense and this Broncos secondary is still playing well. Josh Palmer has set 6.6 or less fantasy points so far on the season in every game, so not even considering him. So, yeah, it's a little tricky with the Chargers wide receivers. We'll kind of monitor that as the week goes on, but obviously whoever Pat Surtain is lining up against, we are not starting. Now, Courtland Sutton, I still think is startable, maybe should be in the flex area, but I think he's an okay start in this matchup. Had some nice fantasy performances in weeks 3 and 4 at 13.8 or more fantasy points, then came back to earth in a good matchup against the Raiders, but the Broncos defense was playing really well. The run game was actually sufficient. So I think Sutton is startable. Maybe not my favorite player in the start category, but in terms of the Broncos wide receivers, he's the guy that I trust, saying that lightly, and then everyone else is just kind of a toss-up for me. We saw Troy Franklin drop, what should have been his first big touchdown, maybe give him his first big performance of his rookie season that gets him back in the mix. And nice ball by Bo Nix was a drop. Marvin Mims, not relevant. Josh Reynolds had a touchdown, but outside of that, he hasn't been consistent in any way on the season. Low Jordan Humphrey every now and then makes a play, but not fantasy relevant. So it's Courtland Sutton as a light start. Everyone else is a sit, and we'll kind of see what happens with the Chargers wide receivers as the week goes on. Next up, we have the Steelers traveling to face the Raiders, and this is another one that could be kind of gross. So George Pickens, what happened in that Sunday night matchup against the Cowboys? Super frustrated. Pickens, they cut his snaps. Mike Tomlin came out and said it was like a disciplinary thing. I don't know. Pickens tried to fight the Cowboys at the end of the game. 5.6 fantasy points. He did have 7 targets, but just 3 receptions, 26 receiving yards. Fields didn't have his best performance, didn't play so well in the first half of the game. He did throw for 2 touchdowns, though. And then now there's rumors surfacing that Russell Wilson might be the starting quarterback in week 6, which I don't know. I don't know what to do with this Steelers offense or this team right now. I was expecting a lot more out of them in week 5 against the Cowboys, especially with how much the Cowboys have been struggling against the run with a quarterback like Justin Fields. And that just didn't happen. And the Cowboys were down 2 of their best defensive linemen, and they looked just fine without them. So Pickens is flexible against the Raiders defense. This defense has been awful. He's flexible, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm a little worried about Pickens right now in the state of the Steelers offense. Now, Calvin Austin, not startable. He had the big week 3. Outside of that, he's done nothing. And then you got Van Jefferson as the next guy with the most volume, also not startable. We'll just move along and hope for better days out of this Steelers offense. Now, I was surprised. Jacoby Myers on the season has had the best fantasy performance against Pat Surtain in the Denver Broncos. 13.2 fantasy points in week 5, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 72 receiving yards. So, little surprised by that, but kudos to Jacoby Myers. Now, I not even mentioning Devontae Adams, I guess I should say. I'm not expecting him to play for the Raiders in week 6. Might be traded by the time this video's out, may still be on the roster, may still be nursing that hamstring injury, whatever it is. Devontae Adams out of the picture here. But I do think Jacoby Myers is flexible against the Steelers. Now, Trey Tucker came back to earth in week 5 against the Denver Broncos at 4.6 fantasy points. I'm going to put him as a desperation flex. Proceed with a lot of caution against the Steelers this week. Maybe he bounces back against the Rams in week 7. Maybe he bounces back this week. He is the wide receiver 2 on this team. He's going to be volatile. We've seen in the previous 2 weeks him get a lot of involvement in this offense. So I'm still going to say he's flexible if you're desperate, but only a volatile desperation flex. Moving into the week. Next up, we will have the Falcons traveling to face the Panthers. We got a lot of potential starts in this matchup. So Drake London coming off of his best fantasy performance, I think, of his entire career, 33.4 fantasy points. And yeah, that is his highest mark in his young career. So He is a little banged up, but I think he's going to be good to go by the time week 6 rolls around on Sunday. So Drake London, the wide receiver 11, this offense starting to come together. Great matchup against the Panthers. He's a must-start player. Darnell Mooney's also a must-start player. You got London as the wide receiver 11, Mooney as the wide receiver 15, and Mooney 31.5 fantasy points in week 5. I'm going to go ahead and say that is Mooney's highest mark of his career. Obviously, this, and it is, in case anyone was wondering, I double checked. But yeah, obviously, this week 5 game script, we're not going to see something like that again, where the Falcons threw the football nearly 60 times and had, over 500 yards of pass offense. We're not going to see that again, but Mooney has been super solid on the season. Great flex option, maybe still a little bit volatile. Like, I want people to understand, like, we don't want to chase these points from week 5, especially with Mooney, who still has a 2.5 performance in week 1 and an 8.6 performance in week 4. But outside of that, 14.6 or more fantasy points in every game on the season. Involved in this offense, Cousins trusts Mooney. He's a solid start against the Panthers for sure in week 6. Now, Ray McLeod. This is a guy who is getting enough involvement in this offense as well against a bad Panthers defense that is flexible. I was in a bad situation going into week 5 in a dynasty league. I had to pick up Ray McLeod and cross my fingers, and he showed up with 12.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards, 11.2 fantasy points in week 4. Definitely still volatility here. We want to be careful, once again, chasing this game script from week 5. 9.2 or less fantasy points in the first 3 weeks for Ray McLeod in every matchup, but 11.2 or more in the last 2 matchups. And it's the Panthers. If you're desperate, he falls into that desperation kind of streaming tier, so to speak. All right. Deontay Johnson came back to earth in week 5, and the Panthers came back to earth in week 5. So this Falcons defense has struggled against the pass. I think Deontay Johnson will bounce back this week. I certainly understand if you're hesitant to start him. I don't think he's really in that must-start area that we saw. I mean, we have to remember they played the Raiders in week 3 and the Bengals in week 4. These are 2 of the worst defenses in the NFL. Came back to earth in a tough matchup against the Bears in week 5. So I think Deontay Johnson is startable this week, but we have to really tamper our expectations, and not just for the wide receiver position, but maybe for quarterback position. Andy Dalton looked horrible in week 5. Throwing an interception, no touchdowns, and 136 total passing yards and 2 fumbles. So we'll see what happens, but I think Johnson is still startable. The good news with Johnson is where you drafted him is you maybe don't have to start him. Xavier Leggett got a little bit banged up. It looks like he's going to be good to go for week 6, dealing with a shoulder injury, but we'll see what happens. I caution you guys to not start Xavier Leggett in week 5. And I'm glad that happened. He's still worth rostering, but let's kind of pump the brakes. He's a sit for me this week, and he may not even play. We'll find out. That left more opportunity for Jalen Coker, rookie out of Holy Cross. And he had a nice game. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 68 receiving yards, 10.8 fantasy points. Not going to start him, though. Maybe worth a stash, but that's about it. Jonathan Mingo has had 5 targets in the last 2 games, but no more than 5.4 fantasy points in the last 2 games. We're not starting him. So Deontay Johnson, the only guy I'll take a shot on here. We'll see what happens with this offense as we go into week 6. Next up, we have the Lions traveling to face the Cowboys. This should be a good one, and this is a pretty easy one to break down. Amon-Ra St. Brown, we start him every week. Obviously, the Lions are on bye week in week 5. Jameson Williams, a great volatile start. I mean, he maybe is in the flex category still because we've seen that volatility. And I know he had 16 fantasy points in week 4, but he only had 2 targets and 2 receptions, just, had that big catch for a touchdown, right? So there's still volatility with Jameson Williams. Maybe consider him just a flex option, but I like him in this game script against the Cowboys. We should see points in this matchup, so I have him as a start. Then, obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a start no matter what. Now, CeeDee Lamb, not the best fantasy day in week 5, but still got you 11.4 fantasy points, 9 targets, 5 receptions, 62 receiving yards. There was a little, I don't know, disconnect between Lamb and Dak Prescott, it felt like, in that game, but I'm not going to read too much into it. These guys are tied together for the next couple years, and they've been together for the past couple years. These things are going to happen. CeeDee Lamb is still a very solid start going into the week. And this Lions secondary, while they've improved on the season, they've also still given up plenty of fantasy points overall on the season to the wide receiver position. So I'm not scared of this matchup, especially on the road. Now, Jalen Tolbert's been a guy I've talked about in the waiver wire videos, talked about him in Saturday's last minute waiver wire video. Encourage you guys to pick him up going into week 5 with, Brandon Cooks on IR dealing with a knee infection, which could be a really bad situation. Tolbert is the wide receiver 2 for the Cowboys. And I know we've seen some involvement out of Kevontae Turpin as well, but Tolbert's been way more consistent and has had 3 double-digit fantasy performances so far on the season and had the game-winning touchdown this past week in week 5. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 87 receiving yards, even without the touchdown, was a really strong last-minute flex option if you needed him in week 5. And he sits at just 17% rostered. He should be rostered in more leagues. He's a solid flex going into week 6. Next up, we have the Bengals traveling to face the Giants on Sunday Night Football, and I'm expecting some points in this matchup. This Bengals defense sucks. The Giants defense is literally light years better than the Bengals defense, but they're still one of these teams that finds a way to allow points. So I'm expecting a good matchup here, believe it or not. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be one-sided, but we did see Joe Burrow just come off one of his best games of his career, 392 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns in that shootout with the Ravens. Jamar Chase also coming off of one of his best games, but certainly not his overall best game of his career. 41.3 fantasy points, 12 targets, 10 receptions, 193 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. We don't need to say anything else here. Jamar Chase is a weekly must start. Now, T. Higgins, a player I encouraged you guys to buy low on while you could over the past 2 weeks, and he had that big performance we've been looking for in once again a great game script shootout between the Ravens and the Bengals. 29.3 fantasy points, 14 targets, 9 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 83 receiving yards. Higgins remains a start until further notice. Yoshi, on the other hand, I thought would maybe potentially benefit in week 5 from the game script, but was still a sit for me and is going to remain a sit until further notice, having just 4.9 or less fantasy points in the last 2 games. There's some other names here like Jermaine Burton and Trenton Irwin, Charlie Jones, but none of them have seen any production in the last 2 weeks. It's Higgins and it's Chase. These are the guys to start from a fantasy perspective. Now, moving along to the Giants, Malik Neighbors missed week 5 with a concussion. There's a chance he misses week 6. I think he'll probably be good to go. Even with missing week 5, he's still the wide receiver 8 in fantasy football, and he's still a fantastic start, a no-doubt must-start player going into the week against this Bengals defense that is awful. Now, Randall Robinson, I was a little hesitant on in week 5. And if you guys have watched the waiver wire videos and the last minute waiver wire videos throughout the season, you guys would know that I've been very high on Robinson since week 1. I was a little worried about him in week 5, though, going up against Seattle. This team's been very good for a majority of the season against the wide receiver position. And then with Neighbors out, I was a little bit worried about Robinson lining up as a true wide receiver 1, but he showed up. 16 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And not only did Robinson show up, but Darius Slayton showed up too. 26.2 fantasy points, a lot of slants, but who cares? 11 targets, 8 receptions, 122 receiving yards, and a touchdown, and nearly had a second touchdown. So let's backtrack for a moment. I think Robinson's a good start, regardless of if Neighbors plays or not, because that's how bad this Bengals defense is. But if Neighbors plays, I still like Robinson more because then all the defensive pressure goes to Neighbors. And what defensive pressure does this Bengals defense even have right now? Darius Slayton, I think, is a sit if Neighbors plays. I mean, we just have to understand that so many targets. I mean, Neighbors has had 12 or more targets in 3 out of his 4 starts on the season. So many targets were vacated last week, and Robinson has had 8 or more targets in 3 out of 5 games on the season. So I just really worry about Slayton. I think if you're desperate, the matchup is there. Maybe we get more involvement. I mean, Daniel Jones has a history with Darius Slayton, so maybe we get something, but I'm just not confident in starting Darius Slayton. I think it was more a product of Neighbors being out. See what happens. He's on he's on the waiver wire video. He's worth watching. And Daniel Jones has not been that bad as you may think over the past couple of weeks outside of the week 4 matchup against Dallas. So I have some belief in this Giants offense on Sunday Night Football, but it's also because the Bengals defense just flat out sucks. All right, final matchup of the week. We got the Bills traveling to face the Jets. This should be an interesting one. We'll start with the Bills. Khalil Shakir may or may not play. He's dealing with that ankle injury. Should really have an asterisk on the screen, but if he's good to go, he's flexible. I don't see as high of a ceiling for him going up against the Jets this week, but in every game he's played in so far on the season, he's had 10 or more fantasy points. So, there's no real ceiling with Shakir, but at least he brings you some consistency, which some of us really need right now in our fantasy lineups. Now, Keon Coleman, I think, is flexible if Shakir does not play. If he does play, I guess he's still in the flex area. I guess the elephant in the room is that Sauce Gardner is going to be on one of these two guys. So they're kind of in that flex area, but they're certainly not my favorite flexes this week. And Coleman should see more production if Shakir doesn't play. But then maybe you have the argument that Coleman is better if Shakir plays because theoretically Sauce will be lining up against Shakir. So they're certainly not my favorite flex options, but they are flex options. I encouraged a lot of you guys who had Keon Coleman to start him in week 5 against the Texans secondary in the absence of Shakir. He did have 5 targets and 11.9 fantasy points, but just one catch that happened to be a 49-yard touchdown. So I don't really trust Coleman. Shakir doesn't bring a high ceiling, and we got Sauce Gardner in the mix. So we'll just see what happens. They're certainly not my favorite, but they are flexible. Mac Hollins was basically the wide receiver 1 for the Bills in week 5, 6 targets, 2 receptions, 4.7 fantasy points. We're not starting him. And Curtis Samuel is 25% rostered, which blows my mind. Curtis Samuel has done nothing this year. This was the game in week 5 that he could have done something without Khalil Shakir. And he had 0.9 fantasy points. So he should not even be rostered. He's not even on the screen. But yeah, I even got questions about starting him this past week. It's like, no way. All right, Garrett Wilson was my top buy low going into week 5. I did pretty good on the buy lows going into week 5. So 29.1 fantasy points against the Vikings. Vikings defense has been great. Most sacks in the NFL, most fantasy points and fantasy scoring. But the secondary has struggled. They've given up, through the first 4 weeks of the season, they had given up the most passing yards in the NFL. And that came to, I know they had 3 interceptions in week 5, which that's something they haven't really done on the season. But they also gave up a fair amount of receiving yards, and most of that to Garrett Wilson, who had 22 targets, 13 catches, 101 receiving yards, and a touchdown. They also gave up a decent fantasy day to Allen Lazard, who really should have had 2 touchdowns, but dropped one of them. Nothing crazy here, and they still had 3 interceptions. But getting back to the point, Garrett Wilson, very good performance in week 5, gets a good game script here against Buffalo in week 6, but I don't know if it's really going to be as good of a game script as maybe some people are thinking. We got Allen a little bit banged up with that ankle injury. We got Rodgers actually banged up with an ankle injury. Both these teams struggling right now, coming off of losses. Maybe things aren't as great here. But I still like Garrett Wilson this week. I still think he's a weekly starter. Week 4, we expected a bad game against Pat Surtain. Outside of that, he's had 10 or more fantasy points every week. So I don't know if the ceiling's as high this week, but yeah, if I'm Aaron Rodgers, we should be targeting Garrett Wilson 20-plus times in a game because this offense is so lackluster outside of him. That includes you, Breece Hall. I digress. Allen Lazard was one of my sneaky starts going into week 5, especially sitting at a low roster percentage. A guy that you can pick up, plug in, that I thought would get you double digits, and that's what happened. 13.4 fantasy points. Had a touchdown, like I said, could have had 2 touchdowns, 10 targets, 4 grabs, 34 receiving yards. He's a top 20 wide receiver in fantasy football, whether you like it or not. Lazard remains in the flex category, and Mike Williams, for me, remains in the sit category. Haven't even considered him all season long, and there's really nobody else here. You got names like Xavier Gibson. You got names like Malachi Corley. There's no production outside of these 3 guys you see on the screen, and this offense is still in a very concerning place. Going into week 6, Wilson, Lazard, good enough starts. We'll find out about the Bills wide receivers. They make me a little bit nervous. We'll see what happens moving into week 6. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single wide receiver, every single matchup for week 6 of the season and who you should be starting or sitting. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 6 of the season, drop me a comment. I will answer every single comment before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. On top of that, we're going to have everything that you need here for week 6 of the season on the channel. Start sits at every position, must start defenses, must start kickers, buy low targets, must start players, a last minute waiver wire video, all kinds of content, as well as fantasy Q&A live streams throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content as the week progresses. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.